The thunder of cannons rolled across Europe as Napoleon Bonaparte rose from a young Corsican officer to a master of war. His armies marched with precision, their bayonets flashing like a sea of steel, and their banners carried the eagle that struck fear into kings and emperors alike. For a time, it seemed no force could resist him. In 1805 at Austerlitz, the battle of the three emperors, Napoleon's genius shone at its brightest. Facing a larger combined army of Russians and Austrians, he feigned weakness, luring his enemies into attacking his right flank. Then, like a trap snapping shut, he unleashed his main force through the weakened center. The Allied armies were crushed, their lines shattered, and the fields of Moravia echoed with the cries of defeat. It was a masterstroke that cemented his reputation as one of history's greatest commanders. But his victories did not end there. At Jena in 1806, the Prussians, proud of their traditions, marched confidently to battle. They believed their discipline could stand against Napoleon's brilliance. They were wrong. The French swept through them with devastating speed, their cavalry tearing into retreating ranks, leaving Prussia humbled in a single day. At Wagram in 1809, against the Austrians once more, Napoleon fought a bloody, grinding battle. The losses were immense. Yet his relentless drive and use of massed artillery pushed the enemy back. Again, the eagle soared and Europe bent to his will. But even the greatest commander cannot escape fate. In 1812, Napoleon turned his gaze to Russia, leading the Grand Armée, the largest force he had ever assembled, into the vast and unforgiving steppes. At first, victory seemed within reach. At Borodino, his army fought the Russians in one of the bloodiest single-day battles of the era. The French captured the field, but it was a hollow triumph. Moscow burned before him, its people gone, and the cruel Russian winter began its silent assault. Hunger, frost, and endless harassment by Russian partisans tore his army apart. What began with 500,000 soldiers ended with only a shattered remnant crawling back across the frozen wasteland. The eagle that once soared now staggered, wounded beyond recovery. His enemies smelled blood. In 1813 at Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, the largest battle Europe had yet seen, Napoleon faced a coalition determined to end his reign. For 3 days, his troops fought with desperate courage, but numbers told the tale. Surrounded and outmatched, the French army was forced to retreat. The tide had turned, and Europe no longer trembled at his name. Yet Napoleon was not finished. In 1815, after exile on Elba, he returned, raising an army once more in a final bid for glory. At Waterloo, he met the British under Wellington and the Prussians under Blücher. The ground was muddy, slowing his attacks. His cavalry charged but could not break the Allied squares. He threw in his elite Imperial Guard, veterans who had never known defeat, but even they faltered under the relentless musket fire. As cries of panic spread, his army collapsed, and with it, his empire. The man who had once ruled Europe was carried away, defeated, his destiny sealed. Napoleon's story is one of fire and steel, of triumph and ruin. His victories dazzled the world, his defeats shook it. He rose higher than almost any man before him, only to fall harder than any emperor could endure. In the echoes of his battles, history still remembers both the brilliance and the folly of a conqueror who tried to bend all of Europe to his will. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power was marked by a series of extraordinary military victories that reshaped Europe and proved his reputation as one of the greatest strategists in history. His brilliance lay not only in his ability to maneuver armies with unmatched speed, but also in his talent for deception, timing, and exploiting the weaknesses of his enemies. From Austerlitz to Jena to Wagram, his triumphs demonstrated both his tactical genius and his ability to inspire men to fight beyond their limits, often against odds that would have broken ordinary commanders. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805 is often remembered as his masterpiece. Known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, it pitted Napoleon's army against the combined might of Russia and Austria. Outnumbered and facing a coalition determined to crush him, Napoleon deliberately appeared weak. He allowed his right flank to look vulnerable, luring the Allies into committing their forces there. Once the trap was set, he struck with deadly precision. His main army surged through the Allied center, breaking it apart while his reserves pressed relentlessly on both flanks. The result was catastrophic for the coalition. Their armies were shattered, thousands were captured, and the map of Europe was redrawn. Austerlitz was more than a victory. It was a statement that Napoleon was not just a commander, but a master of warcraft whose ability to read the battlefield bordered on genius. The following year, in 1806, Napoleon faced the proud armies of Prussia at Jena. The Prussians, steeped in tradition and discipline, believed they could resist the French advance. They were mistaken. Napoleon moved with a swiftness that stunned his opponents, concentrating his forces at decisive points while keeping his enemies guessing. His infantry advanced with precision, supported by devastating cavalry charges that smashed through the rigid Prussian formations. Within hours, the once vaunted Prussian army crumbled. Napoleon's victory at Jena not only humbled a major power, but also showed how his tactics emphasized speed, coordination, and the psychological shock of overwhelming force. To many in Europe, it appeared as though no army could withstand his relentless momentum. By 1809, Napoleon's enemies sought once again to challenge his dominance, with Austria rising in defiance. The result was the Battle of Wagram, one of the largest and bloodiest engagements of the Napoleonic Wars. Unlike Austerlitz, which had been a clean display of cunning and deception, Wagram was a brutal clash of sheer willpower and endurance. For 2 days, the French and Austrian armies battered one another with musket volleys, cavalry charges, and thunderous artillery barrages. Losses mounted on both sides, but Napoleon's relentless determination carried the day. He concentrated his artillery into a massive grand battery that unleashed a storm of fire upon the Austrian lines, creating gaps that his troops exploited. By the battle's end, the Austrians were forced to retreat, leaving Napoleon victorious once again. Though costly, Wagram confirmed that Napoleon's strength lay not only in brilliant maneuvering, but also in his capacity to adapt to circumstances and press forward even when the fighting became desperate and attritional. These victories shared a common thread: Napoleon's mastery of timing, movement, and morale. He understood that wars were not only contests of numbers and firepower, but also of psychology. By striking quickly and decisively, he sowed fear and uncertainty in his enemies, making even strong armies doubt their ability to win. His soldiers, meanwhile, were inspired by his leadership, his presence on the battlefield, and his reputation as a commander who shared both their dangers and their glory. Under his banner, the French armies became instruments of his will, moving with a unity and confidence that left opponents bewildered and demoralized. In the span of just a few years, Napoleon's victories transformed Europe. Kingdoms fell, coalitions broke apart, and new empires rose under his influence. Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram were not simply battles. They were milestones in a campaign of dominance that seemed unstoppable. They established Napoleon not only as a conqueror, but as a symbol of genius in the art of war. Even centuries later, these victories are studied in military academies as examples of how leadership, strategy, and the bold use of deception and force can change the course of history. Napoleon Bonaparte's empire, built on a foundation of brilliant victories, began to crumble under the weight of overreach and miscalculation. His greatest defeats, especially the disastrous campaign in Russia and his final downfall at Waterloo, not only ended his reign, but also revealed the limits of ambition and the unforgiving nature of war. These turning points showed that even the most skilled commander cannot defy geography, weather, and the determination of united enemies. They transformed the conqueror who once seemed invincible into a symbol of hubris and decline. In 1812, Napoleon undertook what would prove to be the most catastrophic gamble of his career: the invasion of Russia. The Grand Armée, an immense force of nearly 500,000 men drawn from across Europe, marched into the vast Russian frontier. Napoleon expected a swift campaign, perhaps a decisive battle that would force Tsar Alexander onto the negotiating table. Instead, the Russians refused to fight on Napoleon's terms. They retreated deeper into their own lands, burning villages and crops as they went, denying the French both supplies and shelter. The strategy of scorched earth left the invaders chasing shadows across endless plains. At Borodino, the Russians finally stood and fought. It became one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars, with tens of thousands dead or wounded on both sides. The French technically won, holding the field, but it was a hollow victory. The Russian army was not destroyed and simply withdrew again. When Napoleon finally entered Moscow, he found a city ablaze, its people evacuated, its usefulness as a prize gone. His vision of triumph turned to ash, quite literally. With winter closing in and supplies exhausted, he was forced to retreat. The retreat from Moscow became a nightmare that would haunt history. Freezing winds, snow, hunger, and constant harassment by Russian partisans and cavalry tore the once proud Grand Armée to pieces. Soldiers starved, horses died in droves, and men froze where they stood. What began as the largest army Europe had ever seen returned as a shattered remnant. Of the hundreds of thousands who marched into Russia, only a fraction survived. Napoleon's aura of invincibility was destroyed. The Russian campaign was more than a defeat. It was a catastrophe that marked the beginning of the end for his empire. Yet Napoleon was not a man to surrender easily. He rallied his forces and continued to fight, but his enemies had learned from their past mistakes. By 1813 at Leipzig, known as the Battle of Nations, the largest coalition army ever assembled at that time descended upon him. Over several brutal days, Napoleon's men fought with courage, but the numbers against them were overwhelming. But sure, encircled and battered, his forces were driven back across the Rhine. The dream of French domination in Europe was slipping away. Even then, his spirit remained unbroken. Exiled to the island of Elba after his first abdication, he escaped in 1815 and returned to France, raising an army once more in what became known as the 100 Days. His return electrified Europe, and his old soldiers flocked to his side, eager to follow their emperor again. But his enemies were ready. In June, on the fields near the village of Waterloo in Belgium, Napoleon faced the British under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussians under Marshal Blucher. The battle began with confidence. Napoleon launched fierce attacks, his artillery thundered, and his cavalry charged across the muddy ground. Yet the British lines held firm, their infantry forming unbreakable squares that repelled wave after wave of French horsemen. Napoleon delayed committing his reserves, waiting for the right moment, but by the time he unleashed the Imperial Guard, his most elite and feared troops, the tide had already turned. The Guard advanced with courage, but relentless musket fire and artillery cut them down. When they faltered, panic spread across the French lines. What had begun as one last chance for glory ended in chaos and defeat. Waterloo was more than just a battle. It was the final act of Napoleon's story. With his army destroyed, he abdicated once more and was sent into exile, this time to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would spend the remainder of his life under watch, far from the fields of Europe where he had once commanded empires. Napoleon's defeats at Moscow and Waterloo revealed the harsh truth that even genius cannot overcome every obstacle. The vastness of Russia, the resilience of his enemies, and the limits of his own ambition combined to undo what years of brilliance had achieved. His rise had been meteoric, his victories dazzling, but his fall was just as dramatic, a reminder that no man, however powerful, can defy history's balance. His legacy endures as both a conqueror of unmatched brilliance and a tragic figure undone by his own reach for more than the world would allow. Napoleon's story is one of dazzling triumphs and crushing defeats, a saga where genius and ambition walked side by side with hubris and downfall. His victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram revealed a commander who could bend the battlefield to his will, while the disasters of Moscow, Leipzig, and Waterloo exposed the limits of power when stretched too far. He rose higher than almost any man of his age, only to fall harder than any emperor before him. Yet in both victory and defeat, Napoleon carved his name into history, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape the way the world remembers the art of war and the cost of empire.